Engine oil leaks can come in all different shapes and sizes, and some can be extremely catastrophic, yet very easy to diagnose, like smacking a hole in your engine oil pan. Thankfully, most of them aren't that bad. However, will take a little bit more digging than simply just looking up underneath your car. In this video, we're going to go step by step on a very logical path to figuring out where our engine oil leaks are coming from. Even though we're focusing on the engine for this video, you can use these techniques to diagnose pretty much any fluid leak on your car. And of course, we're teaming up again with Advanced Auto Parts for this Miata project. You know, before we go out and thrash this car on the autocross course, we want to make sure we don't have any fluid leaks that can lead to an issue or worse, an unintended thermal event. First up, we need to determine that we actually have an oil leak. I've seen tons of oil leaks go unnoticed by vehicle owners because that oil leak never actually made it to the ground. Maybe there's a belly pan underneath, or the oil's getting caught in the subframe, or a well on the transmission or on the engine. Just because we can't see those leaks doesn't mean that we get to ignore them. Failing to fix oil leaks oftentimes can lead to other types of failure. That oil can leak down and contaminate seals, and now you have a coolant leak. It can cause damage to wires. So even minor oil leaks, we really do want to get them fixed. Our first step to finding our oil leak is going to be a simple visual inspection. I prefer to start on the top side of the engine, usually just because it's the easiest place to start. Throughout this diagnosis, we may be working on an engine that's hot. We want to be really careful to not touch this hot engine and burn ourselves. Or really, we want to be careful too spraying brake parts cleaner. That can cause a fire. If you're not sure if the engine is warm or hot, you can turn your ignition on and check your temperature gauge. Or I like to use the back of my hand on, say, the valve cover to see how warm it is. If there's any engine covers or anything like that, this might be a good time to go ahead and remove those so we can get a full look of the engine. So what are we looking for when we're doing this visual inspection? Well, we're going to look for any signs of wetness around the engine. We're also going to look for any signs of staining. That's kind of what you see here on the top side of the valve cover. And of course, we're going to be looking for actual puddles of engine oil, standing engine oil. We're also going to be looking for any gunk caked onto the engine. This could be a sign that there's been an oil leak going on for a really long time. It's also worth mentioning, if you have any known issues, go ahead and fix those first, especially before you add engine oil dye. As I look at the front of this valve cover, this looks really good. But as we pan around to the driver's side, we notice this entire side of the valve cover is covered in residue. If we look right between the valve cover and the cylinder head, we can actually see where it's wet. We know that we have something in that valve cover space that's leaking. Once we have our top side inspection done, it's time to move underneath and see what we got going on down there. Diagnosing an oil leak from the bottom side of the engine can be a little bit tricky depending on the severity of the leak and how long it's been going on. The bottom of this engine is pretty much coated in oil, so if we only use this method, we'd have a hard time figuring out exactly where that oil's coming from. Something to help pinpoint the leak is slide a bit of cardboard underneath your vehicle and let it sit overnight at least. That way, if you have any active leaks dripping off the engine, we'll see it on the cardboard. This will also give you an idea of roughly where that oil would be leaking on the ground. Of course, if there's a belly pan or any protective shielding under the car, you need to remove that first. Another thing we can use on this initial inspection is our nose. If the oil's leaking onto a hot surface, a lot of times it'll burn off, and you can typically smell that, or you can even see that smoke coming from under the hood. Now that we have our initial inspections done, I like to classify my engine oil leaks. Do we have something very catastrophic, oil pouring onto the ground? Well, that's going to be a 9 or a 10. Do we have something very, very minor with just a little tiny bit of seepage? That may be a 1 or 2. This will help me prioritize oil leaks along with other repairs. Once we've identified that we definitely have an oil leak, it's time to pinpoint where it's coming from. There's a few different methods that I'm going to show you. We'll start with my favorite, which is adding engine oil dye, using an ultraviolet light, and tracing the very bright colored glow from our oil leak. The other method we're going to use to find our leaks is either powder or powder spray. Both of these ways have their pros and their cons, and using them is actually pretty similar. Let's start off with engine oil dye, and I like this method a little bit better because it doesn't force us to clean the engine first. We can clean all that oil residue off of the engine if we want, but when we're using oil dye, we don't have to. First thing we're going to do is put our gloves on, and then we're going to dump this engine oil dye into our engine. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to let the car idle for a little while, and we're going to take it on a rather extended test drive. This is going to get all the oil and all the dye circulating through our engine. After our test drive, we're going to grab our specialty light, possibly a set of specialty glasses, and we are going to hunt for a glowing trail of engine oil. Just like with our first visual inspection, I like to start at the top of the engine and work my way down. Now, if you found some spots on your initial inspection that were wet or had staining or were standing oil, I like to start there first. So we're gonna take our light, we're gonna wand our entire engine with our light, and we're gonna look for that bright glowing trail. The color that it glows depends on what color dye you used. As we can see here, we have all this dye around the seam of our valve cover where our valve cover gasket is. So that suspicion we had on our initial inspection is now confirmed. We do have a leaking valve cover. However, we don't want to just stop there. We want to wand the entire engine to be sure we don't have any other leaks. Typically, oil leaks like this, especially in valve cover gaskets and oil pan gaskets, originate in a corner where the gasket changes direction. So those are the places that I usually focus on first. Another place you really want to make sure you check in the valve cover area is going to be the spark plug wells. Pull those spark plug boots up or pull your ignition coils up and make sure that they're not submerged in engine oil. The next method we're going to use is powder to find our leak. This is great for finding a very small leak, especially when something's cracked, like a cracked valve cover or a cracked oil pan. We can use either the basic powder or the powder spray. Now, both of these do work, but I found that the powder actually works a little bit better, plus it smells better too. But it does make a bit of a mess. Step one to using this is getting the suspected area extremely clean and 100% dry. We can do this with our brake parts cleaner or our engine degreaser. If you use the degreaser, I usually go back behind it with the brake parts cleaner and some compressed air at the end to make sure that it's 100% clean and dry. Let's use our spray first. We're gonna spray that powder right on the area where we're chasing our leak. We'll use the spray in the same way we would as if we were spray painting something. Then we're gonna do the same thing that we did with our engine oil dye. We're gonna drive the car or we're gonna let it idle for a while and then trace our leak. Next, we're gonna use the basic powder. Just like with the spray, we wanna make sure that the area is clean and dry. I like to put the powder in my hand first and then apply it to the area that we're trying to find our leak. I found that this way gets the powder where I want it and is a little bit neater. Next, lightly blow that excess powder away, let the car idle or do your test drive, and then we're going to recheck it. Now, a note here on the powder and on the spray, you want to try and not do this in a wet road situation or in a really muddy environment. This can either wash our powder away or contaminate it with mud, and we don't want to ruin our test results. Then we'll come back and trace our leak. You can also use the powder and the engine oil dye together to really make sure you're finding the exact location of your leak. So I feel like we've confirmed that the valve cover is the source of our engine oil leaks, and we didn't really see any other dye anywhere else. The cool thing is that engine oil dye is gonna stay in our system, and it's completely safe to just leave it in there. There's no need to change the oil. So after we get the valve cover replaced and get the entire engine cleaned, we'll be able to do future leak checks if needed. Something you want to keep in mind when you're making an oil leak repair like this is to be sure you do a very thorough inspections on the components. In the case of our valve cover, when we have that valve cover off, of course we're going to clean all of our gasket surfaces, but we want to make sure we're taking a really careful look at the valve cover itself. We want to be sure that the component doesn't have a small hairline crack in it, and that's what's causing the leak instead of just the gasket. We may also run into a situation where the oil leak is hidden. These cam adjusters bolt to this upper timing cover, and I've seen a bunch of cases where it looked like the seal for the cam adjuster was leaking. So first the seal gets replaced and it still leaks. Then the cover gets replaced for warpage and it still leaks. Then the sensor gets replaced and it still leaks. Meanwhile, it was never any of those forward components that were actually the problem. It was this seal leaking, causing oil to get past the outer seal and leak onto the cover. Now in a case like this, you may not actually be able to differentiate which one is leaking. So if that's the case, start with either the easiest or the cheapest thing to replace. While every car and every engine is a little bit different, these are some of the most common places that I've seen engine oil leaks. Starting with the valve cover, just like our Miata here, most often the leaks start in the corners where the gaskets change direction. Next up, engine oil pans, kind of like with the valve cover, they tend to start leaking in the corners. I would say the two most common places that we see engine oil leaks are gonna be from drain plugs and engine oil filters. Drain plugs not being tight, crush washers not getting replaced, drain plugs being too tight, oil pans just being weak and fatigued. All those things can be the source of the oil leak. Kind of the same thing on the oil filter. We have to be careful with those too, because sometimes it's not actually leaking, just someone didn't do a good job cleaning up after the service. Rear main seals are another somewhat common place for engine oil to leak, and I would also add in there PCV hoses and PCV valves. those can be another source of leaks. Hot air and engine oil vapor flowing through that hose can cause it to break down over time. And of course, there's plenty of other methods to chase down and diagnose engine oil leaks. Using a smoke machine is one right off the top of my head that I can think of. If you have a really great method of finding oil leaks, drop it down in the comments and let us know. Now, there are some rules you have to follow when you're diagnosing engine oil leaks. The biggest thing to keep in mind is that oil leaks down. This means that we almost always want to start from the top and work our way to the bottom. That also includes if we're concerned about multiple oil leaks, fix the highest oil leak first, and then we'll work our way down. Now, oil can get blown around and swirled around from either turbulence from underneath the car or the fans blowing it, but oil is only going to leak down from top to bottom. That doesn't mean that it's always going to be easy to find. Oil can leak down right along, say, the cylinder head or the transmission, and then an engine oil leak can be leaking off the bottom of the transmission. But we never want to replace something like an oil pan gasket if the only oil we have is up at the top of the engine. Number 2, engine oil leaks can cause other issues. Most commonly, we see engine oil leaking and contaminating other seals and causing something like a coolant leak, damage to electrical connectors. Oil leaks can even cause damage to accessories like the alternator. With more modern engines, an engine oil leak can actually cause an engine vacuum leak and lead to a check engine light, or even cause a disruption in crankcase pressure, cause the engine to misfire. Older cars are quite a bit more forgiving, but that is still something you want to keep in mind. Also, engine oil leaks can be intermittent. Some may only leak when the engine is hot. Some may only leak when the engine is cold. Sometimes a seal can actually flip back and forth and leak sometimes and not leak at other times. And finally, there's an often overlooked piece of the oil leak puzzle, and that's the PCV valve. The PCV valve uses engine vacuum to pull blow-by gas out of the crankcase. Some really complicated PCV valves also act as oil separators as well. If the PCV valve gets clogged or stuck, it can upset the pressure inside the crankcase and cause a leak. This can lead to excess pressure on the backsides of our seals and our gaskets and cause them to fail quite a bit faster than they should. So pretty much anytime I'm fixing an engine oil leak, PCV valve replacement is part of that repair. Once we have our oil leaks fixed, it's time to clean up any oil left behind. We need to be really careful here. We don't want to end up contaminating other parts of the engine while we're doing our cleanup. Whether you're using a brake parts cleaner or an engine degreaser, you just want to be careful where you're spraying it. Just like when we were looking for oil leaks, I like to throw some cardboard underneath the car to catch any of that sludge that's going to drip down our engine. Now, we got our oil leak fixed, but we want to make sure that that oil leak didn't cause a deterioration of another component that can fail in the near future. So look at your belts, look at your hoses, make sure you don't saturate your alternator full of brake cleaner. I have seen that cause alternator failure. If you're concerned about oil contamination on belts or hoses, now is a good time to replace them before they completely fail and leave you stranded. All right, everybody, I'm gonna wrap it up there. Questions or comments, of course, drop them down below. What other techniques do you use when diagnosing engine or any other fluid leak on your vehicle? I'm gonna finish replacing this valve cover gasket. With that, I'm out. Have an awesome day, and I'll talk to you again next time.